Welcome the anointed ones. The moment someone asks how you knew, the game is already over, because knowledge doesn't announce itself. It reveals itself after the damage is done. Here's the uncomfortable fact most people never talk about. Nearly every major exposure, betrayal, collapse, or revelation in human history wasn't uncovered by genius. It was uncovered by pattern recognition. Intelligence agencies rely on it. Behavioral analysts are trained in it. Seasoned interrogators live by it. The truth almost never explodes out of nowhere. It leaks slowly, consistently, and predictably. The problem is, most people are too distracted, too emotional, or too invested in being liked to notice the leaks while they're happening. You weren't. And that's why they're shaken, because while everyone else was busy arguing, assuming, hoping, or reacting, you were quietly observing. You weren't pacing the room, losing sleep, or drafting dramatic confrontations in your head. You were collecting data without announcing that you were doing so. Tone, timing, contradictions, the strange urgency, the unnecessary explanations, the way stories subtly changed depending on who was in the room, all of it stacked up neatly while they thought they were ahead of you. What really unsettled them wasn't that you found out. People always find out eventually. What rattled them was when you knew, and how calmly you carried that knowledge. No theatrics, no early exposure, no emotional outbursts, just adjustment, quiet recalibration, strategic distance, the kind of composure that makes someone replay every interaction they've ever had with you at 3 a.m., wondering how much you clocked that they never suspected. And let's be honest, there's a strange kind of comedy in watching someone realize they were performing for an audience that already read the script. The forced confidence, the over-explaining, the sudden politeness once the truth surfaces, that awkward pause when they ask, "How did you know?" Not because they want to learn, but because they're terrified of what else you might know and simply haven't said yet. This isn't about being psychic. It's about being perceptive in a world that rewards noise over awareness. It's about understanding people well enough to see where they're headed long before they arrive there. And once you understand that, their shock makes perfect sense. Number one, you didn't predict the outcome. You recognized the pattern. People love to call it intuition, foresight, or luck, because those words feel mysterious enough to excuse their own blindness. The truth is far less glamorous and far more unsettling. You didn't wake up one day with a vision of how things would end. You watched how they always begin. You noticed the same emotional setups, the same power plays, the same shortcuts people take when they think no one is paying attention. Patterns don't need permission to repeat themselves. They only need people who refuse to learn from them. What separates you from most isn't intelligence in the academic sense. It's tolerance for repetition. Most people get bored with patterns because they want novelty. You didn't. You stayed alert long enough to see the loop. When someone avoids accountability early, they don't suddenly develop integrity later. When someone lies casually about small things, they don't magically become honest under pressure. These aren't opinions. They're behavioral laws, and you've watched them hold true too many times to doubt them now. That's why the ending felt obvious to you long before it arrived. You weren't waiting on evidence to explode or secrets to be exposed. You already knew the direction of travel. Once the wheels start turning a certain way, the destination isn't a mystery, it's a timetable. People confuse hope with uncertainty. You didn't. You let behavior speak for itself without interrupting it or trying to correct it. When everything finally collapsed and you weren't surprised, that's what unsettled them. They expected shock, anger, or confusion. Instead, you met the moment with recognition, not relief, not triumph, recognition, as if you were watching something finish exactly the way it was always going to finish. That's the part they can't stand. Not that you were right, but that you were calm about it. Calm means you saw it coming. Calm means you weren't emotionally invested in being proven wrong. Calm means you weren't guessing. And once someone realizes you're not guessing, they understand something else too. You're not easily fooled, and you're not impressed by last-minute performances. That realization alone is enough to leave people quietly shaken. Number 2, you saw the lie because it had emotional fingerprints on it. Most people are trained to hear words, to focus on what is said rather than what is felt. That's why liars often succeed, because the story can be rehearsed, polished, repeated without fault. But emotions are not rehearsed. They leak through behavior like ink bleeding on paper. Anger that's a little too sharp, confidence that's a fraction too forced, laughter that hits a beat too late. These are fingerprints, subtle, invisible to the casual observer, but clear to someone paying attention. You didn't need confessions, evidence, or theatrics. You read the energy behind the words, and that told you the truth before anyone else could even sense a problem. They didn't realize it at the time, but every little inconsistency added up. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't loud, it was quiet and methodical. They assumed no one noticed the way their tone shifted when they were challenged, or how their eyes darted to measure reactions before answering. Those tiny cracks were impossible to hide from you, because you had trained yourself to see beyond the story they wanted to tell. People are bad at controlling the involuntary signals they give off, and you became fluent in their language. When the moment came and you revealed that you already knew, that's when the real shock hit. It wasn't just that you were aware, it was that you could pinpoint exactly where the truth diverged from their narrative. They were stunned because they had assumed control over the impression they created. They didn't understand that you weren't fooled by the surface-level performance. You had traced the invisible fingerprints of deception. Your calm certainty didn't just expose the lie, it exposed them. The moment of recognition, when they realized you had observed, processed, and understood their intentions long before they imagined anyone could, was brutal. That's why people stumble over themselves, scrambling for explanations, repeating excuses, trying to rewrite reality. They weren't merely caught. They were confronted by the one person who could read the language they thought was secret. That awareness alone is enough to make someone feel completely unsettled, because once they understand that you can read the unspoken truth, nothing they do afterward carries the same sense of control. Number 3, you weren't guessing, you were remembering. Most people assume that when someone knows, it's intuition or luck, but what actually shocks people is the quiet archive of experience you carry. You didn't guess the outcome. You didn't rely on hope, fear, or wishful thinking. Every action you took, every insight you shared came from memory, not of events in isolation, but of patterns repeating themselves across time. You've seen the same manipulations, the same performances, the same carefully crafted facades over and over. You remember how they started, how they shifted, and how they fell apart. What others see as unpredictability, you see as a series of echoes, each one carrying the same signature. They didn't think you had that history, and that's why they're shaken. People forget their own consistency. They think their next move is a fresh calculation, a spontaneous decision. But you see the reruns. Every manipulation, every attempt to mislead is a rerun of a scenario you've already filed in your mental catalog. You knew how it would feel to be in the room with them, how they would talk, what they would try to hide, and how their energy would shift under scrutiny. You didn't guess, you recalled. And because you were remembering instead of guessing, your calm was terrifying. They expected uncertainty, hesitation, maybe even mistakes. Instead, you acted with the composure of someone who had seen the script play out before and knew the ending would match the beginning. That's why, when you revealed that you already knew, Their reaction wasn't disbelief. It was awe mixed with panic. They realized their behavior had been predictable the entire time, and there was no improvisation on your part. What really unsettles people isn't being outsmarted in the moment. It's discovering that someone has been quietly cataloging every interaction, every lie, every slip, and can recall it perfectly when it matters most. That is why your knowledge feels inevitable, inescapable, and unshakable. You weren't guessing, you were remembering. And that difference is the kind of clarity that leaves people speechless, scrambling, and quietly terrified without them even knowing why. Number 4, they're shaken because you knew before the mask slipped. People like to believe that deception is a shield, that a well-crafted facade can hide their intentions, their mistakes, or their true nature. They think if they perform convincingly long enough, no one will notice the cracks. What unsettles them most about you is that you didn't wait for the mask to fall. You saw the outline of it long before it even began to wobble. You understood the tension beneath the surface, the strain of maintaining a false version of themselves, and you watched it quietly accumulate until the eventual reveal was inevitable. That is the part that shakes them. They assumed that truth only comes when they choose to let it go, when circumstances force them to reveal themselves. They didn't realize that someone could observe the subtle rhythms of their behavior, the unnatural gestures, the inconsistencies, and understand everything they were hiding while they still believed they were in control. You didn't just see through them. You anticipated the slip, charted its trajectory, and were ready the moment it arrived. That kind of awareness is disarming because it proves that no performance is perfect, and no mask is permanent when someone is paying attention. When the moment finally comes and you reveal that you already knew, the shock isn't about the information itself. It's about timing. They assumed they had a window, a moment to prepare, to adjust, or to defend themselves. But there was no window. There was no preparation. You had observed every micro moment that led to this outcome and understood the full story before they even realized it existed. Your calm acknowledgement of what you already knew is the final blow. It shows them that their efforts to conceal, manipulate, or control were futile. They weren't discovered by chance. They were understood before they even acted. And that realization, the recognition that someone could see the truth while they were still performing the lie, creates a unique kind of fear. The fear that nothing they do can escape scrutiny, and that the world sees them exactly as they are, even when they think they are hidden. Number 5, you didn't react emotionally, and that destroyed their leverage. Most manipulation only works because it counts on a reaction. Anger, panic, defensiveness, desperation. Any emotional spike gives the other person something to grab onto. They can redirect it, amplify it, or use it to steer the situation back in their favor. That's the leverage. You never gave it to them. While they were testing buttons, raising stakes, and poking for a response, you stayed level, not detached, not cold, just steady. And that steadiness quietly dismantled everything they were trying to build. They expected noise. People always do. Raised voices, explanations, confrontations, emotional speeches. When none of that came, the ground shifted under them. Your lack of reaction wasn't passive. It was deeply active. It forced them to sit alone with their own behavior. Without your emotions to distract from it, their actions stood fully exposed, plain and undeniable. What made this especially unsettling is that emotional reactions create predictability. Once someone reacts, they become readable. You can provoke them again, guide them, exhaust them. But when you didn't react, you became unreadable. Every attempt to trigger you failed, and with each failure, their sense of control weakened. Silence wasn't the weapon here. Emotional neutrality was. You denied them the feedback loop they needed to feel powerful. They also mistook your calm for ignorance. They assumed you didn't care or didn't understand. In reality, you understood too well to waste energy. You were already adjusting, recalibrating, and making decisions quietly while they were still waiting for you to explode. When the truth finally surfaced and you revealed that you had known, the shock wasn't just about your awareness. It was about how long you had been operating without emotion guiding you. That's when they realized the leverage was gone. No anger to provoke, no fear to exploit, no attachment to manipulate, just clarity. And clarity is devastating to anyone who relies on emotional chaos to stay in control. That's why they looked shaken. They weren't dealing with someone they could move anymore. They were dealing with someone who had already moved on mentally and left them powerless in the process. Number 6, you understand incentives, not personalities. Most people think they're analyzing character when really they're guessing based on charm, appearance, or words. They get fooled because they're looking for traits, not motives. You don't operate that way. You track incentives. You look at what someone gains, what they risk, and what drives their decisions, and suddenly their behavior becomes obvious. People can act polite, loyal, confident, or generous, but incentives never lie. When you understand what someone stands to gain or lose, predicting their next move isn't intuition, it's math. That's why they're shocked when you seem to know things. It's not that you're psychic. It's that you can see the invisible strings pulling at them, the stakes they're juggling, the outcomes they're desperate to protect. Everything else, their personality, their excuses, their self-portrayed image, is just noise. You filter the noise and focus on the constants, what they want and what they fear losing. Once you see that, their next steps are no longer a mystery, they are inevitable. It also explains why subtlety matters to you while panic matters to them. People are constantly giving away more than they realize in pursuit of what they want. They misjudge risk, mismanage their displays, and miscalculate their audience. You notice it all. And because you see incentives instead of judging character, you remain calm while others scramble to keep up. They expect mistakes, emotional reactions, and surprises to trip you up, but you're already anticipating each move because you understand the driving force behind it. That knowledge is terrifying to them. When you reveal that you already knew, their panic isn't about the facts, it's about realization. They weren't dealing with someone guessing blindly, someone impressed by surface-level charm or manipulation. They were dealing with someone who had studied the underlying architecture of their behavior and could see exactly how it would unfold. That kind of insight leaves them exposed, humiliated, and uncomfortably aware that no mask, no act, and no story can override the reality of what motivates them. You didn't just see through them, you understood why they couldn't hide from you. Number 7. You noticed what they rushed and what they avoided. Truth has a natural rhythm. It doesn't sprint and it doesn't freeze. It moves steadily, comfortably, without needing to be forced. You've learned that when something is rushed, it's usually because someone wants to get past it before it can be examined. And when something is endlessly delayed, it's because they're hoping time will erase the need to face it at all. You paid attention to both, and that's where the real information lived. While others focused on what was being said, you focused on how fast it was being pushed through and what never seemed to get addressed. Certain topics came with urgency that didn't match their importance. Decisions needed to be made right now. Explanations were delivered too quickly, and reassurances arrived before anyone even asked for them. On the other side, some questions were always postponed, redirected, or buried under distractions. That imbalance told you everything. People think deception is about hiding facts, But more often it's about manipulating timing. Rush people past the weak spots. Stall where exposure might happen. You noticed that pattern early. You noticed which conversations they tried to close quickly and which ones they pretended would happen later. Later never came, and you clocked that too. What made you different is that you didn't confront it immediately. You didn't point it out or demand answers. You let the timing speak. Every rush added pressure. Every delay increased weight. Over time, the contrast became undeniable. Their urgency started to look panicked. Their avoidance started to look deliberate. And without you saying a word, the story revealed itself. When everything eventually surfaced and you weren't surprised, that's what rattled them. They thought speed would overwhelm you and delay would wear you down. Instead, both strategies handed you clarity. You weren't confused by the pace. You were informed by it. That's why, when you finally acknowledged that you already knew, their reaction wasn't disbelief, it was exposure. They realized their own timing betrayed them. The things they rushed showed what they feared. The things they avoided showed what they couldn't defend. You didn't need secrets, leaks, or proof. You watched the clock. And the clock told you exactly who they were. Number 8. You trusted the discomfort instead of dismissing it. Discomfort is a subtle signal most people ignore. It's the small unease in your gut when something doesn't sit right, the faint tension in a conversation, the slight mismatch between words and energy. Everyone else brushes it off, labeling it overthinking or paranoia. You didn't. You treated that discomfort as a compass, a quiet indicator pointing toward truths others were too distracted to see. You didn't need loud signs or dramatic revelations. You just paid attention to what felt off. And over time, those small misalignments built an undeniable picture. That's what made them so shaken. They assumed their inconsistencies went unnoticed, that nobody was watching closely enough to piece it together. They didn't know someone was noticing every micro-expression, every hesitation, every unnecessary word, and quietly filing it away. While they were focused on what they wanted you to see, you were trusting the little hints that screamed something different, and those hints never lied. You learned to follow discomfort, not dismiss it, and that turned every tiny slip into a signal, every small contradiction into confirmation. It's not dramatic, it's not flashy, but it's relentless. Every subtle tension, every awkward pause, every incongruity between intent and action became part of a puzzle you didn't need to force. You let the data accumulate naturally. You didn't push for confessions or explanations. You didn't confront anyone prematurely. You just trusted what felt wrong, and that trust gave you clarity before the chaos arrived. When the truth finally revealed itself and you weren't surprised, that's when they realized the impact. They expected confusion, a stumble, maybe a question or two. Instead, your awareness had been building quietly, almost invisibly, until it was undeniable. They were confronted not by guesswork, but by someone who trusted discomfort, who didn't let the small misalignments pass unnoticed, and who had used them to see everything they tried to hide. That's why they were shook. Not because you were loud, but because you were precise. You weren't fooled by appearances. You were guided by subtle reality, and that reality cannot be faked. Number 9, you watched how they treated people who had nothing to offer. Power and true character reveal themselves in the smallest interactions, often with people who can't benefit you, impress you, or challenge you. Most people never pay attention to that. They assume influence is always measured by outcomes, favors, or results. You didn't. You watched how they spoke to the unnoticed, the overlooked, the people they thought didn't matter. That's where the real truth lived. While everyone else focused on status, rewards, or performance, you were observing honesty, patience, respect, or the lack of it, unfiltered, unpolished, impossible to fake completely. That's why when the truth came out, they were rattled. They assumed their image was enough. They believed charm, lies, or carefully curated behavior could mask who they really were. What they didn't count on was that you had already catalogued how they behaved when no one was watching, when nobody could reward them, fear them, or admire them. The careless words, the condescending tones, the dismissive gestures, all of it added up. Every interaction became a data point in a pattern they didn't realize you were tracing. Your knowledge didn't come from gossip, hearsay, or waiting for a mistake to escalate. It came from observation. Every subtle action told a story. The truth wasn't in what they said about themselves. It was in how they treated those they thought they could ignore. And because you noticed it, nothing they tried to manipulate, hide, or fabricate later could surprise you. When the moment arrived and you revealed that you already knew, the shock wasn't just that you were aware. It was that they realized the baseline of who they were had been fully visible all along, even in small, casual interactions. They couldn't claim ignorance, innocence, or exception because you had seen the unguarded truth. That's why they were shaken. They weren't caught off guard by events. They were confronted by someone who had understood them fully long before anyone else noticed, and who had the patience to wait for the pattern to confirm itself. Their hidden reality, the part they thought they could hide, had been in plain sight the whole time, and you saw it. Number 10, you separated information from attachment. Most people get trapped by their own feelings. They confuse knowledge with personal investment, letting emotions cloud judgment and distort perception. They care too much about being right, being liked, or being proven correct, and that becomes a vulnerability. You didn't. You learned early that information and attachment are two entirely different things. You could see the truth clearly without needing it to support your ego, your reputation, or your expectations. That detachment gave you a perspective most people don't have, a clarity that's uncomfortable for those around you because it exposes them without mercy. That's why they're shaken when you reveal that you already knew. They assume your awareness must be tied to opinion, bias, or desire. They expect you to react like everyone else, emotionally, defensively, or passionately. Instead, your calm shows that your knowledge exists independently of attachment. You weren't hoping for a particular outcome, afraid of exposure, or driven by revenge. You simply saw what was happening, understood its trajectory, and registered it. That detachment makes your knowledge feel inevitable, and that inevitability terrifies people. Separating information from attachment also changes how you interpret every move they make. You aren't reacting to the story they want you to believe. You're analyzing the data they provide, the patterns they expose, and the gaps they leave. Words become secondary to behavior. Explanations become secondary to consistency. You don't need proof in the conventional sense because you're looking at outcomes in real time, without the interference of personal preference. When the moment comes to demonstrate that you knew all along, it's devastating for them, not because they were clever or deceptive, they were, but because you didn't need to care about who was right, who won, or who felt embarrassed. You observed dispassionately, and your detachment stripped them bare. Their emotional investments, their manipulations, their assumptions, all of it becomes irrelevant when someone can see clearly without being caught in the same trap. That clarity, that lack of attachment, is what leaves them speechless and unsettled, realizing they've been fully understood without you ever needing to react. Number 11, you understood that secrecy always creates behavioral debt. Every lie, every half-truth, every hidden intention carries an invisible cost. It's not just a moral problem, it's a behavioral one. Secrets demand upkeep. They require energy, attention, and mental accounting to maintain the illusion. People think they're protecting themselves, but what they're really doing is building debt, a ledger of tension that grows heavier with every interaction. You noticed it. You tracked it. You understood that the longer someone carries hidden truths, the more their behavior will subtly betray them, and the more obvious the outcome becomes to someone paying attention. That's why they're so shaken when you reveal that you already knew. They assumed their lies were safe, that timing or manipulation could preserve their image. They didn't account for the cumulative pressure their secrecy imposed on themselves, and they certainly didn't expect someone to notice the cracks before the story fell apart. Every misstep, hesitation, overcompensation, and forced explanation adds weight, and you recognized it as proof long before the truth became public. You didn't need confession. You didn't need a dramatic reveal. You simply watched the debt grow, knowing the account would eventually balance itself, with them exposed and you unsurprised. Secrets are fragile. They require constant maintenance, and even small inconsistencies create tension that spreads like invisible cracks in glass. Most people can't see the cracks in others, and they certainly don't notice them in themselves. You did. Every hurried explanation, every misaligned statement, every overreaction was a payment on the debt they didn't realize they were accruing. You were aware while they thought they were in control. When the moment finally comes and you confirm that you knew all along, their shock isn't just about exposure. It's about the realization that the cost of hiding their truth was already recorded, documented in their own behavior, and visible to someone capable of reading it. They weren't caught by surprise. They were revealed by the natural consequence of secrecy itself, and you were there the whole time, calm, observing, and understanding exactly how it would end. Number 12, you didn't need confirmation, only coherence. Most people wait for proof, evidence, or dramatic reveals before they trust their understanding. They confuse certainty with validation, assuming that nothing counts until it's officially confirmed. You didn't operate that way. You didn't need a confession, a document, or an admission to see the truth. All you needed was coherence, the way actions, words, and energy consistently aligned over time. When behavior, patterns, and consequences formed a complete and logical picture, the answer became undeniable. Confirmation was irrelevant because coherence speaks for itself, and you learn to read it with precision. That's what shakes people the most when you reveal that you already knew. They assumed knowledge had to be verified in a way they could control or challenge. They thought you were waiting, hoping, or uncertain. Instead, you were observing, processing, and trusting the internal consistency of what they revealed about themselves, consciously or unconsciously. Every contradiction, every repeated tactic, every alignment between motive and action built a framework in your mind. When the structure finally connected, the outcome wasn't a guess. It was a certainty. People underestimate the power of coherence because it isn't flashy. It doesn't come with dramatic confrontations, heated arguments, or public proof. It's subtle, quiet, and relentless. While they scrambled to cover mistakes, spin stories, or manipulate perceptions, you were simply noting the alignment of their behaviors and the patterns that emerged naturally. That patience, that focus on consistency rather than spectacle, allowed you to know exactly where things were headed long before anyone else realized it. When you finally demonstrate that you already knew, the shock isn't about surprise, it's about inevitability. They can't argue with coherence because it isn't dependent on opinion, timing, or emotional reactions. It's a structure, a natural consequence of their own actions. Your awareness exposes that the truth has been visible all along, and they were the last ones to notice. They didn't just fail to deceive you, they failed to escape the natural logic of their own behavior, and that failure leaves them stunned, unsettled and fully exposed. Number 13. You never underestimated them. You understood them accurately. Most people either overestimate or underestimate those around them. They see a smile and assume kindness, or a calm demeanor and assume weakness. They misread motives because they filter reality through hope, fear, or ego. You didn't fall into that trap. You never assumed anything about them that wasn't backed by observation, pattern, and consistency. You didn't overplay their threat, and you didn't dismiss their potential. You measured them precisely for who they were, not who you wanted them to be or feared them to be. That accuracy gave you clarity that most people can't even imagine. They're shaken when you reveal that you already knew because they assumed someone could be fooled, could miscalculate, could be caught off guard. They didn't expect anyone to see them with such precision. You understood their capabilities, their limitations, their tendencies, and the exact way they would react under pressure. That understanding isn't guesswork. It's quiet study, patient observation, and relentless attention to detail. You weren't reacting emotionally or impulsively. You weren't hoping for the best or fearing the worst. You simply read them as they were, not as they pretended to be. That level of accuracy is terrifying to people because it removes their control. They can't surprise you, manipulate you, or mislead you. Every bluff, every act, every calculated move is already accounted for in your perception. When the truth finally comes out, and you confirm that you already knew, they aren't just exposed. They're humbled by the realization that you were never in doubt. You didn't need luck, timing, or theatrics. You needed only observation and understanding, and that was more than enough. What unsettles them the most is that they assumed complexity, nuance, or unpredictability would protect them. They believed they were clever or unique. But you understood them as they truly were, without exaggeration or underestimation. That knowledge, held quietly until the right moment, is what leaves them stunned. They didn't fail to deceive you by chance. They failed because you had already seen through the layers, measured every variable, and understood exactly who and what you were dealing with. And that kind of understanding is unshakable. Number 14, they're asking, how did you know? Because they just discovered you're not easy to deceive. People assume that everyone can be manipulated, misled, or misread with enough effort. They operate under the belief that charm, timing, or cleverness can obscure the truth long enough to get what they want. They didn't expect you to be different. They didn't expect someone who could see through the act, anticipate the moves, and remain unshaken while they performed their carefully crafted illusions. That realization that you're not easily deceived is what leaves them rattled and scrambling for explanations. Your awareness didn't come from luck, coincidence, or intuition. It came from consistent observation, pattern recognition, and a refusal to be distracted by surface appearances. You track behaviors, motives, and outcomes instead of falling for charm, excuses, or theatrics. That's why when they ask, how did you know? It isn't curiosity, it's fear. They realize that their efforts to manipulate, conceal, or mislead were wasted because you saw everything from the start and understood it clearly. Their surprise isn't about information being revealed. It's about the fact that you were already ahead of the game. What unsettles them the most is your composure. They expected shock, anger, or uncertainty. Instead, you remained calm, collected, and precise. Your knowledge wasn't reactive. It was preemptive. You didn't just catch them in a lie or uncover a truth. You anticipated the arc of their actions and waited, knowing that everything would confirm what you already saw. That level of foresight makes deception feel meaningless, and the shock comes from realizing they were never in control. When they finally acknowledge your awareness, they confront a truth they can't argue with. You aren't impressed by performance, manipulation, or fear. You see clearly, act deliberately, and understand fully. That's why they ask, how did you know? They're shaken, not by what you revealed, but by the understanding that they cannot deceive you, mislead you, or hide anything from you without it being quietly noted, processed, and anticipated. You are not easy to fool, and that fact alone leaves them exposed, unsettled, and powerless in a way they never anticipated. The truth about awareness, perception, and insight is simple, yet most people live their entire lives oblivious to it. What sets you apart isn't luck, chance, or some mysterious sixth sense. It's the patience to observe quietly, the discipline to track patterns, the skill to separate behavior from intention, and the clarity to trust what you see rather than what people want you to believe. Every move, every word, every subtle shift in tone has been noticed, processed, and stored. You don't react impulsively. You calculate with precision. You don't guess, you remember. You don't follow illusions, you follow patterns. And because of that, the world doesn't surprise you. People do. But even then, it's not about being one step ahead to boast or to dominate. It's about seeing clearly, understanding deeply, and operating from a space of calm authority that leaves deception powerless and pretense exposed. This is why the question, how did you know, resonates so profoundly. It's the realization by others that they were visible the entire time, that their attempts to hide, manipulate, or mislead never went unnoticed, and that their actions spoke louder than any words ever could. You weren't caught up in emotion. You didn't need validation. You simply observed, trusted the patterns, and understood the incentives. Every subtle sign, every small inconsistency, every micro moment of truth was accounted for. And when the moment arrived, your clarity became undeniable. That's what leaves people stunned. That's what leaves them unsettled. And that's what proves beyond any doubt that awareness is power. But only when wielded with precision, patience, and understanding. If this message resonated with you, if you've realized the importance of seeing clearly and trusting your insight, then take action now. Subscribe to the channel to join a community of viewers who refuse to be fooled or distracted. Like this video to support content that challenges the ordinary and reveals the extraordinary. Comment below with your thoughts and experiences. Share what you've noticed, what patterns you've recognized, and how clarity has transformed your life. And share this video with others who need to see the truth for themselves. Knowledge is only powerful when it's shared, observed, and understood. And now it's your turn to step into that clarity. God bless you.